My name is Christina Lay, and I am a U.S. Career diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. My next assignment is to Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, in the Consulate General. I'll be serving as the political chief. The views presented here do not necessarily represent that of the U.S. government.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over. Thank you so much for coming on today. What was your childhood like where you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Oakland, California in the 80s and 90s. My parents came to Vietnam after the war there. And I'm sure that you know, but the 80s and 90s were not exactly what it's like in Oakland today. There was definitely a lot of crime and violence. There was the Rodney King riots, LA riots, and discrimination against Asian Americans. My siblings and I were the only non-Black kids in our school. And then when I was about 10, we moved to Boston, which was a completely different experience, predominantly white, much more affluent than Oakland. And we experienced racism in kind of a different way there. So these two very different experiences shaped my views on inequality and race and social justice in America, and also on our American educational system and the types of resources that are provided to public schools. And in both communities, there were Vietnamese American communities there, but the Boston one was much smaller. And we didn't grow up with a lot of cousins and extended family. And so my influences, cultural references were mainly from my parents. So that is basically my childhood.
What made them move to Boston from Oakland?
So Oakland at that time, I mentioned there was a lot of violence going on. And so my parents were really afraid for me and my siblings. They witnessed a lot of school violence, not like in terms of guns as you see today, but physical violence and fighting and all that. And I think they sensed that the educational system wasn't as strong as it could be. My dad, he was acquainted with someone in the Boston area who ran a little convenience store out there, and the friend invited him to come out there and he'd show him the ropes. And so he decided he heard it was a lot safer, the school systems were better, all that. So he moved us all out to the East Coast.
What a huge change, right? Because the West Coast and the East Coast at any time is
for sure
different. It's a very different environment.
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely grew up more East Coast than West Coast now that I've met a lot of West Coasters.
So before we get into the work that you do, what does it mean to be Vietnamese to you?
That is such an interesting question. I really love listening to your podcast and listening to other people's responses. I find that really, really eye-opening. For me, I think it's an incredible time to be Vietnamese today. Not only is Vietnam changing and advancing rapidly, it's becoming America's number 8 trade partner. It's number 5 number of Vietnamese students studying in America. And it's on track to become a high-income country by 2045, which is incredible. There's limitless potential in our bilateral relationship, which will benefit both people in both countries. And then from the Vietnamese American perspective, I think America has progressed immensely from the cultural view of Vietnam as synonymous to war. And growing up, my view of our presence in the United States was that we were the product of war. And there was some level of shame to that, given the political complexities at that time, domestically. And we were living through generational trauma and secondary memories that weren't our own. We were bridging cultural divides between America and Vietnam for our parents. We weren't fully American, not fully Vietnamese. And behind us was this painful past for both Vietnam and America. But today, it's incredible. I see a very bright and beautiful future for Vietnamese Americans. I wish I had what we have today when I was growing up. And there's an emergence of Vietnamese studies in universities and colleges in America. There's films and podcasts like this one that celebrate our culture and diversity and contributions. And social media and the internet just allows people to learn more about the country of Vietnam, but also Vietnamese Americans here. And people can express themselves in ways that I don't think I knew was available to me growing up. And we aren't now defined by war and this past, in which political decisions were made by an elite few, but instead, while our parents may have been refugees and victims of war who struggled and survived, today they're proudly American and proudly Vietnamese. And for those of us who were born in America, I think we're a generation who have evolved from direct grief and death. We are embracing all the many facets of being human that have always existed, but were overshadowed by this history that was told by others, this history of war. And so today we're entrepreneurs and we're journalists and musicians and athletes. We're writers and professors and doctors and diplomats. We're no longer just the children of our parents, but we are ourselves parents and aunts and uncles who can influence the next generation and expand what other people in our own communities see as Vietnamese. And so while we may have been a product of war, we're more than a war. And we are Vietnamese and we are American and we are ourselves and we don't need to be defined to be whole. So I am incredibly proud and happy to be Vietnamese American today and then have this monumental shift and change and in our culture that Vietnamese Americans do not have to be defined by war.
What a rich and beautiful answer. Thank you for that. I want to go back to that remark that you just made about Vietnam being a high income country by 2045. It's a two-part question. First of all, what is the metric that places Vietnam as a high income? And secondly, what is causing that to happen by 2045?
I think there's a lot of factors. I'm no expert on the economic side of things, but I do think that there's a shift more in terms of foreign direct investment in Vietnam, as you know yourself. There's a lot of people who are interested in Vietnam, seeing it as this investment opportunity. Just has a huge potential for growth in terms of the young population, the higher income that people have, but also as a direct alternative to China. We've seen in the past few years, as a result of China's policies regarding COVID, a lot of companies have redirected their operations to Vietnam. A lot of people see it as a better alternative. And then, I don't really have the particulars and details to get into it, but even this past week, the Biden administration announced restrictions on doing business in China, which I think will affect Vietnam indirectly.
You speak many languages very well and fluently. Greek, Spanish, English, Kyrgyz. Kyrgyz. I recently heard that you scored for your Vietnamese language test. I wonder what that mechanical side of somebody's brain like yours to take in all of the ability to speak these languages. Like, I simply don't know how to ask this question, but mechanically, what do you think is driving that ability for you to learn this at high level?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm very privileged, I have the great opportunity through my work to, study languages full time. So I do think that is a huge part of it. People who pick up, Duolingo or classes here and there, it really takes definitely dedicated time and effort to get to any level in a language. But I also think it's just practice. I know myself. I know that I'm a visual learner. I know I need to practice with actual native speakers in order to get better. I need to be able to not be afraid of making mistakes and looking silly if I make mistakes when I'm speaking. Always writing down new words, looking them up later, committing them to memory, things like that. I think it's just after so many iterations of learning different languages, I know how I learn and how to improve. There are other people, for example, I'm not auditory learner, so I can't really pick up things from music or movies that other people do. I have to actually see the written word and actually use them. So I think it's different for each person, but I have just figured out what works for me.
And when you say you're privileged to do this full time, I mean, how does that work with the workload that you have for the government as well as learning full time? What does that mean? It's hard to kind of understand that.
Yeah, yeah. So I work for the Department of State, and I am part of the U.S. Foreign Service, our diplomatic corps. So I'm a U.S. diplomat. And in a lot of other countries, in order to become a diplomat, you have to already come in with skills or language proficiency in foreign languages. So, for example, I think in Mexico, you have to come in already knowing being fluent in English and a second language. But for the U.S. government, there is no requirement. Because we have a Foreign Service Institute, a school out in Virginia, very close to DC, that is, I think, 80% dedicated to teaching foreign languages to our US diplomats. And so it's built into our training when we're assigned to serve overseas in a country, that we have dedicated time to learn that language before we're deployed out there. So for Greek, for example, I was in Greek language for 6 months before I began my assignment out there. For Japan, it was 2 years, 1 year in the US, and then a second year in Japan, fully immersed, because the language is that difficult. Yeah. So, and it just depends on which country you're going to and the level of difficulty of the language. But the State Department and Congress values the language proficiency of our diplomats in order to do the work. And so we have dedicated time where we are being paid full time. That's our full time job to just learn the language.
That is mind blowing to think.
Yeah.
Cool detail about the work that you all do. When you were growing up, did you have an inclination to live and do work beyond the United States? And did you have sort of a travel bug? I mean, what kind of inspired the future of your life to be doing this kind of work?
So I grew up pretty poor in America. So my family, we didn't travel back to Vietnam and we didn't travel overseas. So I didn't really have an inclination to go overseas. It wasn't even a possibility for me. But when I was in college, I studied abroad, and that was a really life-changing experience for me. I studied abroad in Spain. I lived with a host family, went to classes completely in Spanish, and it was just an incredible experience to be challenged in that way, but also see another country's culture and history and people. So I think that tapped into my love of learning. But also, I think I had always felt like an outsider in America, being, the minority in Oakland and then being the minority in the Boston area. And being overseas was kind of a way to fully embrace that outsiderness, if you will, because no one expected me to know everything. No one expected me to be part of the culture, part of the majority. I could be the outsider looking in and learn and be allowed to make mistakes. And I'd impress other people if I exceeded their expectations. So that was also a nice reinforcement. And living overseas gave me an opportunity to explore and grow in ways that I don't think I could have in the United States. So that kind of sparked my desire to live and work overseas.
Speaking of this idea of being an outsider, I often talk about myself as having a difficult time, even at this. I'm turning 48 here in a few months, and I feel still that I'm never fully American and never going to be fully Vietnamese. Are you afflicted with that pain?
I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as pain. I do understand what you're saying. I do feel that my Vietnamese will never be at the level where it is. People will see me as a native fluent speaker, but I'm way better than my colleagues, for example, right? But you don't get credit for that. Or being American, I feel like there's many ways in which I'm so different from my parents and other VQ, where I am Vietnamese American. I'm not Vietnamese overseas. And yet there's still elements where I don't feel truly American. I don't necessarily think that it's painful. I do think that sometimes Americans, or as humans, we have difficulty coexisting with conflict. And I think that my experiences living overseas has allowed me to be a lot more comfortable with living dualities or living with conflicting interests or identities, that doesn't make it hard to achieve what I want to achieve or to be comfortable or any of that. But I do get what you're saying.
Yeah, it was weird for me. I always felt comfortable in being in the Vietnamese community, and I always felt like comfortable being in white America. But I just never felt part of it. I felt comfortable, but I didn't feel part and valid. It was never validated for me to be, it just was never 100%. But I always felt like I understood, being Vietnamese more than my other friends that were Vietnamese that were born in America. But at the same time, like when I went back to Vietnam throughout the last few decades, it just never, I could never be part of them.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
strange place to be.
Yeah, it is. I do think that's what I mean by we're living in such a wonderful period right now in America because I do feel like people who are younger than us, who are Vietnamese American, might not have that experience
Yeah.
because they are surrounded by so many examples of being Vietnamese American or the diversity in America in and of itself that I don't think that they feel like as much of an outsider as we may have when we were growing up or even now, I think there's a change in that. And I think that's really beautiful.
So when you were in college and you were preparing for a career, an unknown, or you didn't have like a clear path, what were you thinking that you will be doing?
So initially started studying economics at the University of Chicago, which is what it's known for, and it was incredibly difficult and theoretical. And the University of Chicago is very rigorous academically, and so ended up switching to international studies and political science because I took a course that was kind of between economics and political science that really fascinated me. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do after I graduated, I had felt some pressure to go to graduate school, go to law school, more traditional paths. But I discovered the Peace Corps, which was an opportunity for me to go overseas, live and work overseas, while at the same time deferring student loan repayments, which was very key. This allowed me time to think about what I wanted to do while at the same time helping others, getting involved in public service and doing something worthwhile with my time. So, that's what I decided to do. And I think that is sort of the path that led me to a career in the Foreign Service. My parents definitely were not very happy with the Peace Corps. They didn't really understand what it was. My mom even sent me to my uncle to get a lecture, and he was, basically telling me my parents didn't flee a third world country for me to go back to one. That my parents wasted all this money on a fancy school tuition for me to just volunteer, overseas. But I think that's a conflict that we deal with too, honoring and sacrificing, honoring and respecting the sacrifices that our parents made coming to America, but at the same time trying to chart our own paths and figure out what we want to do with our own lives, not for ourselves and not for them.
I think there's very few people in America who have even heard of the Peace Corps, let alone know what the Peace Corps is about. Can you tell us a little about what the Peace Corps is and what your experience was and what country, the whole nine?
Yeah, sure. So, Peace Corps was started by John F. Kennedy, and it was a way to provide Americans with an opportunity to serve America, serve our country overseas, public service, going to different countries around the world and volunteering for 27 months, so a little over 2 years, 3 months of training and 2 years of your assignment. And the goals of the Peace Corps is basically to bring American values and ideas, exposing other countries to America, but also bringing back ideas and cultures from other countries back to America. And so I think it I think predominantly it has been the majority white for volunteers, and that's because it is, for a lot of immigrant children in America, it's, you have a choice of after graduating going into the private sector or going into a field where you immediately make money to, help back pay your student loans, but also support family members, extended family. And I think that's a luxury that a lot of people, to go to the Peace Corps is a luxury that a lot of people don't have. And so I think Peace Corps is trying to diversify now, especially trying to represent the variety and diversity of people in America overseas to foreigners. But yeah, it was an incredible experience. It was a very difficult experience. It definitely was one of the most challenging experiences of my life, but it also taught me a lot of things about myself. I think it even made me feel closer to my parents. Going to another country and understanding what it was like to go, not speaking the language, not understanding the culture, having to adapt. The beginning stages, just gesticulating or trying to communicate with people, but and living in rural areas that were extremely deprived and lacking in resources. So it made me understand a lot about what Vietnam was probably like for them growing up, and then what it was like to go to America, being a completely foreign experience for them.
So when you get dropped into a country, a third world country like that, do you have to live within families that are, basically dirt floors, and or you put in a hotel in a proper Peace Corps sort of sanctuary?
I think it depends on your assignment and the situation you're in, what country you're in. For me, the first 3 months they kind of ease you into it. You're living in a training village with the other American volunteers. You live with a host family, and every day you study the language and you get technical training to do your job. And then every lunch and every evening you go back to your host family, and it's the most amazing language learning experience, because you're learning language during the day and you're coming back and you're actually practicing it with real people who don't speak English. And then after 3 months of that training, then you're just dropped off into your assignment, and that can be you living in an apartment in a city in that country and teaching at a university or working at a health center or whatever it is. Or it could be like my experience, which I think is the majority of people's experiences, living in a very rural area, living with a host family. So I lived with a host family for 2 years, no running water, in a house, no dirt roads, all that, and teaching English there.
I'm like pondering that. That's from University of Chicago, you're going from like a big name school and you get dropped into the middle of nowhere. Now, when you say assignment, how is that kind of figured out from the US government? Like what is the tenets? What is the goal of an assigned Peace Corps volunteer?
So when you join, you have you can list preferences on whatever region you want to go to. I think now it's changed that you can actually specify what countries you want to go to. But when I did the Peace Corps, and this has been a long time now, I specified Asia. I really want to somehow get to Asia and have that experience. But Kyrgyzstan is considered Central Asia. So I ended up in a former Soviet country. Um, and they base your assignment in that country on your skill sets as well. So there are folks who have experience, um, with health care or environment, agriculture. I didn't have any of those skill sets, so I fell into the bucket of teaching English. So that's basically how I got my assignment.
I often think about this question of where people all around the country, all around the world, you see intelligence, smart people everywhere, right? You get dropped into a rural place or an underdeveloped country, you run into smart people and you bump into smart, intelligent people everywhere you go on earth. I often wonder, what are the things that keep countries as a third world country? I know it's like a really theoretical question, but what is your kind of thoughts on why countries don't get to excel and grow? I know there's probably an infinite amount of answers for that or directions that you can go with, but what are some of the things that really hold countries back?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And like you said, there's definitely multiple reasons why countries are still developing or have difficulty advancing. I
Because you
do
think
think,
about Vietnam is like such like a hotbed of really smart and intelligent people, and I think about like the 70s and the 60s and how could such a smart, intelligent group of people get stuck behind and be entrapped in all these situations. But I'm sorry, I just I'll let you answer.
yeah, I I think that a lot of it has to do with political leadership. Um, I think that really matters a lot in developing countries and advanced countries because uh, when you're lacking in strong political leadership of people who want the country to advance and want the citizens of that country to do well, you face a lot of vulnerabilities like corruption.
Mm.
And corruption affects, free and fair elections. It affects the economic stability of that country for economic investment. Other countries will not want to invest if they feel like their money is going to disappear or it's at a risk. Um, there is a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong if the judicial system is not strong enough to be able to enforce laws to ensure that people are protected, that their economic interests are protected. Um, so I think about certain countries in the world, like that have benefited from, modeling their systems, political systems after the US and other democracies and how they've benefited economically, but also in terms of providing for the social good for their people. So I do think that is a huge element of that.
And you would think that these political leaders all around the world could see that, could model, best practices off of like the bigger countries, the more developed countries, right? You would think that these leaders would be, well, look, they did it, and they went from here to there. And why don't we just try to tighten up our ship here? What causes, I mean, other than greed and that kind of ill will, but you would think smart people can figure this out as the leader of a country.
I think you've hit it though. It is greed. I think it is self-interest, when there's no rule of law and people can benefit individually, personally. I think it's hard to see beyond yourself, unless there's rules and checks and balances in place to force people to do good for the better of all, right? Um, so I think that is a major component in
Yeah.
why a lot of countries, and there are actually psychological social studies that show that people in positions of power, their brain mechanisms change when they have that certain level of power. I think there's some sort of you know positive reinforcement in your brain when you have power. So that's really hard to counteract as well.
It's a dark thought. Um,
Yeah.
when you left the Peace Corps and you got back to the United States, what begins to happen?
So I get back to the United States, and well, when I was in the Peace Corps, there was another Peace Corps volunteer, and her parents were Peace Corps or were U.S. diplomats, and so she convinced me to take the test with her while we were overseas in Kyrgyzstan. So I took the test, and I came back to the U.S. and I started working for an NGO in D.C. And then I had passed the written part of the exam and I had passed the personal narratives, the essays portion, and they called me in for the oral exam, the oral assessment. And I also passed that. And so I thought, well, this is a opportunity to go live overseas for a couple more years before I decide to go to graduate school and pursue whatever career it is that I have figured out in my life to do. But it's been 14 years and I've been loving it. So that's basically what happened.
So you get in, and how difficult is that process at the time?
It is a very extensive process. So, in order to become a US diplomat and be a member of the Foreign Service, you have to take a written and oral test and write these personal narratives. And the personal narratives are basically 6 short essays that are in response to prompts that ask the candidates to demonstrate or provide examples of their intellectual, interpersonal, communication, leadership skills. And the written test is offered only several times a year, and it consists of 3 multiple choice sections that cover situational judgment, English language and grammar, and then job knowledge. And that last portion covers things like US government, math, economics, society, world history, culture. And then the fourth part of that written test is a timed essay. And then if you achieve a certain score in the written test and your personal narratives, then you're invited to take the oral assessment. And the oral assessment is a day-long interview split into 3 parts: a group exercise, a structured interview, and case management exercise. And then once you've passed, you're given a score, and then you're put on a register. It's a rank ordered list of all the other successful candidates, and there are the number of people who can become diplomats every year is mandated, I think, by Congress, and so the State Department will invite you from that list if you have a certain number of a certain level in your score. And then you can sit on that register for, I think, up to 18 months. And if you don't get called up, then you have to do the whole process over again. Yeah. So it's very, and that's not even mentioning you have to do a medical, financial, criminal background check in this whole process in order to get top secret clearance. So if you don't pass any of that, then you're not joining the Foreign Service.
The LSATs for law school, really, I think for me, it's like a litmus test of how logical you can think, and how your mind can hone in on sort of logical precision. What do you think that these battery of tests, is trying to figure out for people in the Foreign Service?
So they list basically 13 dimensions, they call it, in the Foreign Service that they're looking for in order to get into the Foreign Service. And I think you'd probably be able to just guess them, but they are cultural adaptability, composure, your judgment, resourcefulness, working with others, your written skills, your communication skills. Um, um, so along those lines, that's what they're basically looking
It's
for.
almost like EQ they're looking for.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because the Foreign Service is so diverse in terms of where you're working, what you're doing, that I think you do need to have a foundational basis on oral communication, interpersonal skills, judgment in order to be successful. That um, I think, and what's interesting is the criteria for joining. You don't need a special degree. You don't need to speak any foreign languages. You just have to be a U.S. citizen between the ages of 20 and 59. That's it.
So it's not too late for me.
Yes.
But we'll get into that in a bit, because I think it requires traveling and uprooting family. Family.
Yeah.
Wow, 59, huh?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
yeah, that's a pretty wide range.
Yes. Yeah. So we do have so many different people joining. I have former colleagues who were 55 and who basically, and then the mandatory retirement age is 65. So they basically were in the Foreign Service for just 10 years, which was great for them. It was like a second assignment or second career after retirement. Yeah. A lot of veterans actually join as well, military veterans. So after they hit, 20 years in the military, they apply and join and do another 20 years.
Wow, I got to think about this. This sounds like this wonderful adventure. What is the primary uh task of the Foreign Service of the United States?
So since the founding of the United States, I think we have recognized the value of establishing and cultivating relationships with other countries in order to advance our U.S. national interests abroad and to protect Americans. So our relationships with other countries helps facilitate trade, ensures peace and security, and helps tackle global issues and challenges like terrorism or climate change, or more recently, the pandemic. So we have embassies and consulates all over the world, in almost every country in the world. And the diplomats, the foreign service officers who work in these embassies and consulates, work to engage with other countries to address these global challenges and to promote security and prosperity, democracy, and development. So our work is very diverse. It ranges from issuing visas to people who want to come to America for tourism or for work, to Americans who lose their passports overseas or somehow end up in jail. It ranges from negotiating trade agreements to helping support free and fair elections in other countries, to facilitating foreign military cooperation. So there are 5 cones in the Foreign Service: political, economic, management, public diplomacy, and consular. But there's also specialists as well. So medical practitioners, IT, engineering professionals. We have diplomatic security as well. So there's a whole range of professions within the Foreign Service.
And is it broken down? In my very simpleton mind, the military is broken down sort of in like enlisted, which are sort of the worker bee, blue collar, and officers. Excuse me.
There's so many ways in which we can compare Department of State to Department of Defense, but that's not one of them. Actually, we're very similar to DoD in a lot of ways, but that's not one of them. I think the Foreign Service generalists, as we're called, are kind of considered able to do all these different kind of cones, quote unquote, career tracks: political, economic, consular. And then we have the specialists who have advanced degrees, who are like the doctors, the engineers, and all that. So I don't know if they're a direct equivalent to officer enlisted corps.
Because I imagine, as a layperson thinking about advancing within the structure of foreign service, like what's the ultimate end goal for somebody
I see.
right?
Yeah. Okay. So I think, okay, maybe I'll have to retract that then. I think maybe the way we can make that analogy work is that these specialists, even though they have the advanced degrees, are probably the enlisted who do not take on leadership roles to become ambassadors and all that. And it's actually the generalists who are more like the enlisted who become the leadership in the State
So
Department in
ironic,
the
right?
future. Yeah.
And then dentists and doctors in the military typically don't become the leadership as
Right.
well.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And what is your sort of trajectory, like in your mind, when you are pursuing 20 years, 30 years to go to retirement? Where does a person like you want to end up in leadership ultimately?
So I think as a career diplomat, the pinnacle of your career would be becoming a U.S. ambassador. So we have, 200 some missions all over the world, and 2/3 of those positions are career diplomats, people who have been doing the work as a diplomat for over 20 years. 1/3 go to political appointees who are connected to whatever U.S. administration is in office at that time. So I think for a lot of people, the goal is to become an ambassador, be in very high levels of the U.S. government making our policies. But I think in terms of what is a successful career, there are plenty of people, like I said, retired military who do another 20 years in the Foreign Service. That can be an extremely successful career too. I think people have different goals. Some people want to be able to travel the world or provide opportunities for their kids to live overseas, and that in itself is a successful career. And there are others who really want to focus in and narrow in on subject matter, like they really want to be the experts on Iran policy or economic sanctions, or they want to be that China expert, And so advancing in the career ladder isn't necessarily their goal either. So I think it varies depending on the person, but I think traditionally it's to become an ambassador.
Now that leads me to the next question. What does it take to become an ambassador?
Yeah, you know, that is a good question.
I mean, it sounds like
uh,
a hazy, like how do you become a president of the United States, right? It's like one of those things where there probably doesn't sound like a clear pathway, a lot of luck, a lot of goodwill that you put out there. I just can't imagine what it takes to become that.
I think you're right. I think the way the Foreign Service is kind of structured, as you go along in your career, you build connections with people, and those connections with people, whether you're above you, below you, around you, help build your reputation and help you succeed. And I think a lot of ambassadors have succeeded because they have built those relationships, that they have proven their competence. They are respected by their peers and others, and if they focus on a subject matter like a region of the world, let's say Asia or Africa, or if they focus on a topic matter, thematic issue, they then have that expertise to be valued and trusted to take on leadership positions. So I do think a lot of it's interpersonal skill, a lot of it is your intellectual abilities and knowledge. So I don't know, and luck probably.
And is it appointed by like a committee? How does this work?
Yeah. I'm only at the mid-level, really. So all of this is very opaque and not very transparent. I do think that the State Department is trying to make it more transparent, especially as the State Department is attempting to diversify, because over 60% of the foreign service is male and almost 80% are white. So that is definitely an issue, and in the senior levels, that's even more pronounced. So for the selection process for leadership positions, they actually have committees that decide on who should be in those positions, and usually we call them bureaus. So Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Bureau of European Affairs, Bureau of African Affairs. They come up with a short list of candidates who they think should be ambassador to X or Y or Z country. And then that is elevated to this committee, and the committee is supposed to be diverse and representative of senior leadership in the department, who then choose a candidate, and then that goes to the White House, and then the White House approves. And all ambassadorships are presidential appointments, so the ambassador or the president then approves of that person. And of course, it goes through a whole process of making sure the country that is receiving that ambassador is in agreement with the person that we as the U.S. government want to send. It also goes through the Senate. The Senate has to be confirmed by our Senate Foreign Relations Committee as well.
So here's exciting news from you. You're leaving very soon to Vietnam,
Yes.
to be in Vietnam. But before we get into that, does the fact that you are a Vietnamese person by heritage, and one day becoming an ambassador from the United States to Vietnam, is that a political sort of quagmire for the State Department, or is that something that could typically happen?
Hmm. I the U.S. government doesn't have a policy of not sending people because of their ethnic heritage. So we have had ambassadors in the past who have been of that country, represent that country. The first example that comes to mind to me is Sung Kim, our ambassador to Indonesia right now. He's of Korean heritage and was our ambassador to South Korea, which was an incredible way to represent the
Yeah.
diversity of America. So we're definitely not precluded in any sense. It is a political decision at the highest levels for those types of assignments. I think at the lower levels, it becomes a lot more complicated because um, we want to be able to balance using the skill sets that people have in terms of linguistic or cultural or substantial knowledge that they have to bear when they are of a certain ethnic heritage, while at the same time making sure that there aren't any security concerns about that person serving in that country. So we have had, we call them assignment restrictions that restrict certain diplomats from serving in certain countries because of their ties to that country. And these can be financial ties, maybe they have investments in that country. These can be familial ties, maybe they have a lot of relatives there that might impede them from being able to do their work. And this is actually this is an issue I'm very passionate about because I was the president of the Asian American Foreign Affairs Association, which is an association that's part of the Department of State. And during the time that I was president for 3 years, 2 years, and as vice president for 1 year, we came across a lot of employees of Asian descent who felt like they were being restricted from assignments based on their heritage and not based on any sort of security risk. Like they had no financial ties, they didn't have citizenship to that country, they didn't have relatives there. And yet at the same time, there were other employees who are non-Asian, who are married to Asian spouses, who are able to serve in those countries, which to a lot of these employees, it felt like discrimination that these other employees had stronger ties, stronger familial ties and financial ties that would complicate their service in that country. And yet only because the employee themselves were of that ethnic heritage, they were being restricted from serving there. So and this was a decades long fight against the department to advocate for reforming these procedures to allow people to understand why they were being restricted and be able to refute that information, because a lot of times the information was incorrect, it was outdated, or if someone said, "Oh, you have family ties there," but turns out all those family members have since passed away since you first joined the department, or if you the financial ties you had there, you've gotten rid of them. Or a lot of times they're wrong, incorrect information that was based on another person that somehow their file got into yours. So we basically advocated the department to create an appeals process that allowed people to see their files and see and understand why they're being restricted, and then refute that in order to be able to be considered for that assignment again. I think this is to the benefit of the State Department and the American people, to have people, who have the linguistic, cultural abilities to serve in that country. So this is still an ongoing issue because I think there's still some problems in how these assignment restrictions and preclusions and reviews, the nomenclature is very confusing, are levied for people. So I'm still a member of the advisory council for this organization, and we've been working to try to help the department improve their processes.
This organization is an outside entity, obviously beyond the Foreign Service, right? It's something that's set up not in the government. Or is
it is. Yeah, it is actually. It's a volunteer organization within the State Department that does include other foreign affairs agencies. So we are not, while the Department of State is the majority of diplomats and foreign service officers serving overseas, there's actually three others. Foreign Commercial Service, part of the Department of Commerce, that helps advance trade overseas. Foreign Agricultural Service, that helps promote global food security and advances agricultural exports overseas, and the foreign U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which helps international development overseas. So those organizations are included among in the Asian American Foreign Affairs Association, but it is all under U.S. government.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is a real thing about white men in countries like Vietnam or Taiwan. Sounds funny, but there's like white guys for hire that will be the figurehead for a corporation just so they have some symbolic ties to like an American company or a British company, to make it seem official that it's just not Vietnamese people doing business, but it's somebody at the top who's running the organization as a white man. This is a very real thing in Asia, as I've been back and forth for over 2 decades, and I see it. And that perception is a thing that exists. And I'm so glad that you are being in a position to be in Vietnam, and it really shatters that idea, that paradigm of having a white man from the United States do the work that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I do think that diversity is our strength. It's our competitive advantage that we have in America that we definitely need to tap into and deploy overseas. Like I said, the statistics bear out that we're still not very diverse. We're not alone in that in a lot of elite institutions in America, of course. But evidence shows that diverse teams perform better. And diverse diplomatic corps in the Foreign Service would more effectively formulate and implement policy in our national interests. And it would build stronger relationships with foreign countries, when they see someone who looks more like them or someone who doesn't look like what you traditionally think of as an American. I think it expands their worldview of what it is to be American, which a lot of times people in foreign countries, their views of America are through films and music videos and all that is not truly representative of the diversity of America. And I think that the lack of diversity also undermines our ability to conduct foreign policy overseas, and it harms our foreign policy making process when a lot of people with the same viewpoints are the ones creating our foreign policy and are the decision makers. And we've seen in our history how that's affected the whole world when, we have a myopic viewpoint and we don't see the diversity of ideas to build our foreign policy. And it also prevents us from fully evolving to face 21st century challenges in the world. It creates groupthink and creates conformity bias that also results in blind spots and keeps out diverse points of views. And this ultimately harms U.S. foreign policy and the American people. So I think we can't build that vast network of foreign relationships and gain insight in other countries if we don't have diverse people who are able to tap into those different groups. So a woman, diplomat is able to converse with women NGOs in a foreign country much better, easier than a man. Or conversely, it might be possible that men would be able to engage with law enforcement better in a foreign country than a woman would, Well, also, women can also engage with law enforcement in foreign countries in a way that men can't because they don't have those barriers, in terms of, trying to one up each other, and a lot of times women in foreign countries are seen as, especially American women, as the other. There's ways in which we have this competitive advantage, and if we have more diversity in the Foreign Service and our diplomatic corps, then we can have better results and better foreign policy.
So we had talked earlier a few months ago about you coming on to the podcast today, and then hopefully like in another year, have you back on to kind of compare and contrast like the ideas. So I want to kind of spend this next few minutes talking about what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to in serving in Vietnam? And what do you hope to get out of it?
Yeah, so I am extremely excited to serve in Vietnam. This has been a lifelong dream for me to work and live in Vietnam. I think that it's definitely a very desirable post. A lot of people among my colleagues want to serve there, and I would say that almost all the people who have served there have really enjoyed it, have had wonderful experiences. I do think that there may be challenges for me serving as a Vietnamese American that my colleagues might not face. And so everything I'm about to say is speculative, and so I might be wrong in my assumptions. And you might know more because you've been working and living there on and off yourself. But I think this is an incredible opportunity because of the advantages I have that will help me do my job better. It's the linguistic skills, the cultural, understanding the cultural nuances, and then having some similar shared experiences with Vietnamese people like that, or going to temple or all that help foster people-to-people ties. But on the flip side, I also have been told that I might not be viewed as a diplomat, that I might be viewed as an interpreter, for example, and not be respected. I have been told that maybe Vietnamese people might assume that I have some biases about Vietnam because my parents are from the South and left Vietnam. And then there's also a lot of unconscious biases involved with being young and Asian and female that would exist in any country, not just particular to Vietnam. Um, and then there's also the matter of the Vietnamese diaspora community, and some of whom are vehemently against any sort of progress between America and Vietnam. And that I think is a factor in how I'll be perceived there. But I do think that being Vietnamese American is a unique and extraordinary opportunity that speaks to the American experience, right? Where else would you have a US diplomat serving in the country that their parents are from? Whatever challenges that there may be, I welcome them as an opportunity to learn and grow and maybe help others learn and grow as we work to promote shared interests between our two countries.
And what will be your primary goal while you're there for the State Department?
So I will be. So we have embassies in the capitals of all of our foreign countries, and then we have what are called consulates. And consulates are basically like branch offices of the embassies, and they are not in the capital. So in Vietnam, we have our embassy in Hanoi, and we have our consulate in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. And in the consulate where I'll be working, I'll be the head of the political section. Our political section serves to the area that we cover would be from the central region, from Da Nang down to all the way down to the south. And the embassy covers everything in the north from Da Nang and up. And so I'll be covering 33 provinces in Vietnam. And I will be working to advise the embassy, ambassador, political section up there, but also my consul general, who's the head of the consulate, on political issues in Vietnam and how they might impact our bilateral relationship. And so these range from different issues involving like domestic political leadership to human rights issues to our political military relationship and Vietnam's relationship with other countries, like, for example, China or Cambodia, other ASEAN countries. So I'll basically be serving as an advisor to our leadership and also writing reports to Washington about the situation on the ground.
And basically, how many people from the United States government, foreign service, are in sort of like these positions like you? Is it like 100 or 50 or, I mean, 1,000 people?
I don't remember the exact number, but I believe we are 35,000 strong, and maybe there's about 15,000 diplomats in the US Foreign Service all over the world.
But what about just specifically for Vietnam?
Oh, Vietnam. So I don't know the exact number. Embassies are much larger than consulates in terms of personnel. I do think we do more visas in the South, and so our consular section might be larger. The political section in the consulate is much, much smaller. There are um, anywhere between 3 to 5 Americans working in the political section in the consulate. And I think in the embassy, there's more like 20.
Oh, so there's not a big contingency. It's maybe
No.
50, maybe from the United States working in the consulate or embassy. I mean,
No. So the numbers I gave you are just for the political section. So we also have, the management sections, public diplomacy, economic section. So it's much larger. But yeah, I do think that one of the issues that we have is that we're chronically understaffed. There's just so much more work to be done, and yet our numbers are dictated by Congress. So we are very small in our representation overseas, and we could be doing a lot more.
and how long is your assignment and what does it look like if you want to extend your time there?
So my assignment is 3 years, and that's pretty normal for assignments overseas, unless you're in a dangerous location or a hardship location, whereas your assignment might be 1 or 2 years. And then I have an option to extend for a fourth year, but I don't think that I can extend beyond that. So it will be either a 3 or 4 year tour.
That's pretty heartbreaking when I think about it because if you get your fourth year extension and you love being there so much and you adopt it sort of as a second home, which I imagine you will because of the connections to the people there. It'll be heartbreaking to finally have to pick up to move back home or to the next assignment after you're done. Uh, is this something that you had to have gone through before?
You mean changing
Yeah,
assignments?
changing assignments. But I'm thinking about specifically for Vietnam one day. Like, what happens
Yeah.
emotionally when that happens?
Yeah, so the way that the Foreign Service is structured, you have these time limited assignments. Basically, in order for you the idea, I guess, behind it is that you won't become too local, that you remember to represent the United States
Oh,
overseas. And so by moving every few years, you're not, um, you have a change in perspective. You don't become too entrenched in the local views that you can't represent the US government. But that doesn't mean that you can't return. So there's a lot of returnees. Like our ambassador to Vietnam right now is Mark Napper, and he served as a political counselor in Vietnam before. So this, I think, is either his second or third time in Vietnam. So there are many people who we call them repeat offenders, who go back over and over again. And that happens, people go to Japan multiple times because the language is so difficult. We have a smaller pool of people who speak the language fluently. This happens with Italy, for example, or Mexico. A lot of people end up going back to their previous country of assignment. And it might be in a different position, a different city, but that does happen. So you're not losing entirely the expertise
got it.
and the knowledge that you had there. Yeah.
Because I think Ted Osis did 8 years there, right?
He opened up the embassy in Saigon in the 90s, and then I think came back 20 years later as the ambassador. Yeah,
Amazing.
what a story. Yeah.
What a story. Yeah, I had him on a few years ago or last year maybe, but what an amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and he's just such a nice and wonderful man.
Yes, I listened to your podcast. I also read his book, Nothing is Impossible, and I saw him speak at two events in DC. He is an incredible person.
Yeah, that would be amazing if one day that was, the role that you were able to play. That would be awesome for all of us to see.
That's so kind of you.
Now, the attrition rate for officers must be high, I imagine. Is it, or am I just kind of like I'm way off here?
A lot of foreign service officers join and see this as a lifelong career. And it's because the benefits are great. You don't get a private sector salary, but the benefits in terms of pension, healthcare, job security, and when you're overseas, the government provides the housing for you as well as educational expenses for children. But the State Department now is collecting information and disaggregating information on the types of people who do leave to determine whether a lot of women or minorities are the ones who are leaving, because a lot of them have unique challenges, such as childcare or elder care and other obligations, like other family, extended family that might be financially dependent on them, that might affect their ability to continue serve overseas as diplomats.
You recently got married, and I think your situation is a very interesting one and a very awesome one when I think about it. Your Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course.
Your husband is a soccer coach for, I think, the Cambodian national team.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
mean, how aligned was the universe for that to happen? Like, how did that all go down?
I don't know. I sometimes don't believe in fate, and yet this is like really convincing me that that maybe it's fate. But he is Argentinian, and was a professional soccer player, played in several countries before injuries led to his retirement, quote unquote, in his 20s. He went back to school and got a coaching license, and then ended up connected to Keisuke Honda, who is this superstar Japanese soccer player. So he ended up working for Keisuke Honda in multiple countries all over the world, and then through him started coaching as the national team coach for Cambodia. And now, after a hiatus during COVID, he's returned to Cambodia to coach as their head coach. And I mean, I couldn't have imagined a completely different career than diplomacy. But at the same time, sports is diplomacy is a component of the State Department and how we develop people-to-people ties and connect with the people because soccer or football is universal. You know, there's so many other countries in the world that play football, and you don't really need much. You know, you just need a makeshift ball. In a lot of countries, it's not even a ball, right? And the passion is incredible in a lot of countries in the world, and now developing in America too. You know, we have Messi here in the United States, also Argentinian. We have us, North America, hosting the World Cup in 2026. So I think this is an incredible opportunity for America to embrace this sport.
And did you get the news of your assignment first or his assignment first? And what happened if you guys didn't get assigned to the same region?
So we met in Japan when I was assigned there. He was setting up a private club team there right before the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic hit, and he ended up being stuck there because he ran out of passport pages in his passport. And the Argentinian embassy had shut down, and the Argentinian government was not issuing new passports. So he kept just extending a Japanese tourist visa while he was there. So, you know, after almost a year of this, I said, you know, maybe you should just quit and stay. The vaccinations hadn't come out. It was still too dangerous to travel overseas. There weren't international matches with FIFA and soccer. And so he ended up staying in Japan and getting his master's online through Johan Cruyff Institute, which is out of the University of Barcelona. So we ended up, I had to bid on my next assignment, and we were thinking that because he has connections in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, that we try for one of those countries in that area in order for him to pursue his career as well. There were some offers for Latin America, but I think that he feels very passionate about developing Cambodia soccer. I think he has a very strong personal connection to the people there and the development of the country's sport. And I've always had this dream of living and working in Vietnam, so it just seemed to make sense for us to try to find an assignment for myself in Southeast Asia.
Hopefully, we can get him over to Vietnam and coach for the Vietnam.
Yeah, we'll see. Vietnam is very strong. I think Vietnam's team is the strongest in Southeast Asia.
So let's talk about that. So the women's team just competed in the World Cup. What does that do for a country like Vietnam?
I think it's incredible. I think there's a lot of exposure that happens with that, you know, and I think also the soccer world tends to be, and you know, I'm saying this from a place of ignorance because I didn't follow soccer. I'm not a soccer fan. I only watch the World Cup every 4 years. And then when I met my husband, started following it more closely. But I do think that it's an incredible opportunity for a lot of countries. Like, I think people love the underdog, you know. So, you know, even the men's World Cup and the women's World Cup, people are rooting for Morocco, and Jamaica, and Vietnam. I think it's an incredible opportunity to showcase the talent and the countries themselves for the world. So I think it was incredible that Vietnam was able to compete in the Women's World Cup this year.
You know, 10, 20 years ago, I was trying to convince all my friends to take a trip to Vietnam and to be a part of the growth of Vietnam in one way or another, whether it's in spirit or just support or actually moving there like my brother. And today we get to see this sort of participation with the women's World Cup. And I am able to sit in front of a person like you who's born in America, who is highly articulate, who is going to live in Vietnam for a few years to do this work. I am so proud of how far we've come as the Vietnamese diaspora and Vietnam as a mother country. And it's all coming together. It's a good time to be Vietnamese. And thank you so much for your service to the United States and for the future time that you're going to be spending in Vietnam.
Thank you. Thank you for your words. And thanks for this opportunity to speak to you. I've been listening to your podcast and all the episodes, and I think you're making a huge contribution for the next generation of people too. And not just Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese, but, you know, I've learned of this podcast through a colleague. So, someone completely not involved in our diaspora community or in Vietnam. So, thank you for all that you're doing too.
Thank you for the kind words. And I hope that in a year, we can get back on the podcast to talk about what it was like for you, because you're leaving in a few days, and maybe by the end of next summer we can get back on another podcast to hear your experience, and I look forward to that.
I look forward to that too. I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.